go back in because then I can see everybody. Okay. Lovely, great. Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming today. So this is a learning event for the Carol and Susan SAR. I'm Gemma White. I'm a practice lead at Herefordshire Council. I'm a social worker and I've been with Herefordshire for 7 months now. So my role is around workforce development. So part of my role is providing training, but I also look at auditing and policies as well. I've been a social worker for 19 years this year. I've worked in a variety of local authorities and in a variety of different adults teams throughout that time. So what are we here to do today? We are going to find out what a Safeguarding Adults Review is. We're going to look specifically at what the learning is from the Carol and Susan Safeguarding Adults Review, and we're going to think a little bit about how you can apply that learning to your role. So in the presentation, I've shortened Safeguarding Adults Review to SAR, to SAR. So when I talk about a SAR, I'm talking about a Safeguarding Adults Review, but that's quite a mouthful to say every time, so I've shortened it to SAR. So today, just a few ground rules. If you could keep your microphones off, because that makes it easier for everybody to hear. We are recording this one, so I have asked that you saved all your questions till the end when we can stop the recording and we can go through questions then. If my tech plays up, please discuss the topic amongst yourselves and I will rejoin as soon as I can. My laptop did fatally crash on Tuesday in the middle of some training I was delivering, so hopefully it's not going to happen again this week because that's never happened to me before. But again, the same to you. If something happens, you know, and you get thrown out of the meeting, just rejoin when you can. You can provide feedback to me at the end of the session, but Lowry and Kirsty from the Safeguarding Adults Board will be sending out a copy of the slides and a feedback form to you, so you can provide feedback formally that way and you will have a copy of the slides, so don't feel you have to furiously make notes on everything because we're going through. Okay, and I guess I just want to kind of set the tone for today, really, that this is about a supportive learning environment. You know, we are talking about the deaths of 2 vulnerable adults, and you know, perhaps some of us in this session you know, might have been involved in working with them or know colleagues who worked with Carol and Susan. So I just want us to be very mindful that we're empathetic to our colleagues, but also that we're coming with a spirit of curiosity so that we're having an open dialogue and feel able to ask questions and value the different experiences and backgrounds that we all bring with us, because there's quite a mix of people in this meeting from different organisations. Okay, so what is a Safeguarding Adults Review then? So a Safeguarding Adults Review is essentially a review that happens when an adult who has care and support needs has died or suffered serious abuse or neglect, and there are some concerns that perhaps the different agencies involved in that person could have worked better together to prevent that harm from occurring. It's very much coming from a perspective of not blaming anybody. It's Safeguarding Adults Review take a systems approach. So it's not looking at what individuals did, it's looking at how can the systems around vulnerable people work better to safeguard vulnerable people. It's about looking at what went wrong, but not who caused the problem. You know, the aim is to prevent it from happening again, really. So it's about, having an open approach to mistakes, and emphasizing that no one individual is to blame. But it's about understanding the systemic issues that led to the harm occurring. So the Carol and Susan SAR looked at quite a long period of time. Carol and Susan were a mother and daughter. Carol was 68 and Susan was 44, and they were very sadly found dead of suspected suicide within 2 days of each other in April 2024. So the Safeguarding Adult review that looked at both of their deaths covered the period from December 22 to April 2024. So the learning that we're going to be looking at today comes from that period. So that learning comes from a review. An independent lead reviewer was appointed and managed the process. And as part of that, they would have they spoke to the practitioners involved. They did a practitioner learning event. They held interviews with key staff, and they also spoke to the friends of Carol and Susan to get a flavour of what was happening from their perspective, really, and to ensure that that Carol and Susan were kept at the heart of this learning as well. Okay. So I've mentioned, that they were very sadly found dead of suspected suicide within 2 days of each other. And I want to talk a little bit more about who they were, really. And I just want to start with this picture. So this is a photo of Lanzarote. You might recognise the kind of, the black volcanic mountains. Prior to the pandemic, to the coronavirus pandemic, Carol and Susan both really enjoyed going on holiday to Lanzarote. That was something they did as often as they could. They really enjoyed their time there. So I chose this picture because I think it's quite a nice reflective picture. It kind of speaks, the road running through it kind of speaks of a journey, really. And I think that the learning that's come out of this start is part of all of our learning journeys, really, to try and prevent harm coming to vulnerable adults. So Carol and Susan were mother and daughter. So Susan was a service user, and Susan had a number of formal diagnoses. She had a learning disorder, learning disability, language development disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder, alongside a number of diagnosed health problems. So, she had a lot of complex needs. And before COVID, she lived at home with her mum, with Carol, and Carol was her main carer, and Susan also had support to do community-based activities as well. But then in the weeks leading up to the first coronavirus lockdown, Susan's mental health began to deteriorate, and she was experiencing very high levels of anxiety, particularly around her physical health. And this kind of culminated in her being detained under the Mental Health Act in May 2020. This was because of concerns around her self-harm, and that she was being physically and verbally aggressive to her mum, to Carol. So she had a period in hospital, detained under the Mental Health Act, and from there she was discharged into full-time residential care. Whilst she was in residential care over the next 4 or so years, almost 4 years, she had increasing contact with her mum, Carol. And this built up to weekend contact. She was going home on a Friday, going home to Carol, staying with Carol. Carol was caring for her until the Monday when Susan would return to the residential home. And in 2023, there were some discussions about Susan moving back with Carol permanently, but there was no definite plans or time scale for this. And then in January 2024, Susan had been to stay with her mum for the weekend and decided not to return to the residential home, permanently. She wanted to stay with her mum permanently. And so a Mental Capacity Act assessment was done, and that determined that she had the capacity to make that decision. So from the January until her death in April, Susan was living at home with Carol. So who was Carol? So Carol was Susan's mum. She was 68. She had a number of chronic physical health problems, and she experienced a lot of pain associated with those. And she was also known to various agencies because of her own ongoing mental health problems. She had a history of abuse and trauma, and she tended to be referred to mental health services when she'd had arguments with Susan or when she had lots of concerns about Susan's care. Her mental health deteriorated really rapidly then. But despite these multiple referrals, Carol was always discharged because Carol either didn't want to engage or didn't feel ready to engage with psychological interventions. So Carol had cared for Susan all her life until 2020 when she moved into residential care. And once she moved into residential care, Carol had a lot of concerns about the quality of Susan's care and had a lot of objections to the medication that Susan was prescribed. Carol wanted Susan to return to live with her full time, and did lobby various people like her local councillor and her MP to try and make that happen. So Carol and Susan's relationship was complex. It was clear that they loved each other, but that they were often unable to get along. Their relationship could be volatile. So Susan was known to be physically and verbally aggressive towards her mum, although Carol, frequently denied any abuse. But also Carol made hurtful comments to Susan, and there were some suspicions of coercive and controlling behaviour of Susan by Carol, but these were never formally evidenced. So yeah, they both loved each other very much, but their relationship was very complex, and they found it very difficult to get along. And that, so very, very, very complex situation, and two people with very complex needs as well. So the Safeguarding Adults Review identified 6 areas of learning. Now, unusually, 2 areas of good practice were identified in the SAR, and that was around capturing Susan's voice and assessment of Susan's mental capacity. So although there was some learning around that, there was also some areas of very good practice, which we'll talk about. And then we're going to go on and look at the learning around recognising Carol as a vulnerable adult, and look at our responsibilities to carers, because the Safeguarding Adults Review highlighted that was an area of development for the agencies involved with Carol. And we're also going to talk a little bit about advocacy services as well, because that was something that could have really benefited Carol. So we're going to talk about that. And then the last one is multi-agency working and information sharing. And this comes up very, very frequently in any kind of safeguarding adult review, or any reviews where someone has come to harm. So, that's an area that we all still need to do better on. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that works specifically in this situation for Carol and Susan, because there were two very complex individuals with professionals around them. So we're going to look a little bit about what might have helped in this situation. Okay, so capturing Susan's voice. So as I said, there was some good practice around this. The review found that all of the professionals involved with Susan, were very proactive in terms of understanding her wishes, listening to her, finding out her viewpoint. And it could be difficult to communicate with Susan, and staff, particularly the NHS professionals involved with her, showed great skill and knowledge in communicating with her. And that extended to helping her be involved in meetings about her care and support needs. So, for example, when time allowed, easy read resources were used. And I think what's really lovely to see in this review as well is that even when professionals disagreed with Susan and her point of view, there was evidence that her views were still considered as part of the decision-making process. Her voice was still listened to. So even though she may have disagreed with professionals, she was still kept at the centre of some of the decision-making. There was also good practice around advocacy for Susan. Susan did have an independent statutory advocate who was able to develop a meaningful relationship with her. There was continuity in who that advocate was, so they could really build up a relationship, which meant that the advocate was able to represent Susan in a really meaningful way. And also there was good practice highlighted around Susan having an appointee to manage her finances. There was a lot of pressure from Carol for Carol to manage her finances, but all of the professionals involved in Susan's care thought that it was in her best interest for that management to remain with an independent appointee, and kind of stood firm in that, really, and that was identified as good practice. So there was lots of positive stuff going on around communicating with Susan, listening to her, and enabling her to be involved in her care and support planning. But there was some learning around capturing her voice. So some of the learning was around ensuring that adults with learning disabilities are offered the option to be seen alone whenever appropriate. The review period went back to 2022, which was obviously the tail end of COVID, when working practices had shifted to online. So, this specific learning relates to that period. But, I guess the review is just highlighting that, it's really important that we offer adults with learning disabilities the option to be seen alone whenever appropriate, and to see them face to face wherever possible, because, working with people who have communication challenges, that's much harder when you're doing it through a screen rather than face to face. And the review also highlighted that Susan's health passport held a lot of really useful information about how to communicate with her. So health passports, or hospital passports, as they're known to some people, are a live document that's held by the person with learning disabilities, and they set out the best way to communicate with someone who has a learning disability. And they are a resource, that they're held by the person with learning disabilities. So professionals can say to the person, or say to the people who are supporting them, do they have a health passport, and can I have a look at it? Because it gives us really good tips for how to communicate really well with that person. So for example, for Susan would sometimes be asked a question and respond and say yes or no, but it was only when she'd had a chance to really think about the question and process it and what it meant for her, that it was only at a later date she was able to say what she really felt. So for example, that information was contained in her health passport. So the review thought that it would be really useful for all professionals to know about these health or hospital passports, and that they should be shared more widely. I have found a little video which explains them a little bit more, so we'll watch that on the next slide. If you could just give me a thumbs up to confirm that it is playing and you can hear it when I start it, because hopefully it's going to do that. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to so that was just a video explaining what hospital passports are, and they do contain a lot of really useful information for anybody that needs to communicate with someone with a learning disability. So whether you're in commissioning, whether you work for social services or a charity, if you are working with someone with a learning disability, then do ask them or the people around them whether they have one, because that will be really helpful when you're working with that person. Okay, so the second learning point was around assessing Susan's mental capacity. And again, there was lots of good practice identified in the review. So the mental capacity assessments were detailed and thorough. Assessments and best interest decision making was done in line with the principles of the Mental Capacity Act assessment. And Mental Capacity Act assessments were revisited and redone when there were changes in circumstances or when Susan changed her mind about things. Mental Capacity Act assessments were also done by the person who was best placed to do them. So sometimes Susan could be distrustful of social workers, which obviously would have impacted on any kind of assessment of her capacity. So at that times, other professionals undertook the assessments. So there was lots of good practice identified. There was some learning though, and I'm going to talk about a policy that can support you in those situations. So in January 2024, when Susan decided she didn't want to return to residential care, she wanted to remain living with Carol permanently. She had Mental Capacity Act assessment. That was done over numerous visits with multiple professionals involved. It was detailed and thorough, and it was found that she had capacity to make that decision. But as part of the learning events, when the review was taking place, some professionals said they were surprised that she was found to have capacity to make that decision. and that they thought that Susan was subject to coercive and controlling behaviour from Carol. But there was no evidence of those concerns being raised at the time. This learning is really around highlighting, it's really important to have conversations where we may have different opinions to other professionals. And the Safeguarding Board does have this policy to support us in having those conversations. So there is this policy guidance on resolving professional disagreements. There's a link to it in the slides, so you will be able to, it's on the Safeguarding Adult Board website. This policy sets out that there are some when an adult is at risk of harm, the professionals around that adult can have areas that they have a difference of opinion in, that perhaps they disagree with each other, and these kind of areas can commonly be around the outcome of Mental Capacity Act assessment, around eligibility decisions for services, or perhaps around the outcome of a safeguarding inquiry. And in those instances, this policy can support practitioners in raising those disagreements. So there's three stages to the process. Stage one is trying to resolve it practitioner to practitioner. Stage two, escalates it to team managers, and stage three, if the situation still can't be resolved, escalates it to senior managers in the different organisations. So there is a form to track the kind of the progress and the resolution to those disagreements. So it's only a couple of pages long, the policy, so go away and have a look at that, and just be mindful that if you do have a different opinion to a different professional, and you can't resolve that in conversations between both of you, you can't come to a shared understanding, there is this policy that can support you to resolve professional disagreements. Okay, so the third piece of learning was around recognising Carol as a vulnerable adult. I've already spoken a little bit about Carol. So she didn't have formal mental health diagnoses, but she was recorded as suffering PTSD as a result of the events that led to Susan being detained in the May 2020. And she'd had many referrals to mental health, but didn't ever feel ready or willing to engage with psychology. And on top of that, she could misuse alcohol as well, and had declined any support around that. And we know neighbours and friends had reported Susan had been physically and verbally abusive to her. So there was she was clearly very, very, very vulnerable and had her own needs, but because she was so driven to advocating for Susan, she neglected a lot of her own needs, really, and used the professionals that were there to try and support her. She would try and use them to advocate for Susan as well. And as part of the review process, the independent reviewer and auditor looked at a safeguarding concern that was raised in 2023 about Susan being physically aggressive to Carol, and that identified that the possibility of domestic abuse was overlooked, or wasn't considered in enough depth. So this learning is really just about highlighting that domestic abuse can take place between people who are personally connected. That's what the Act said. So domestic abuse doesn't just occur between, a man and and a woman in a sexual intimate relationship. Domestic abuse can take place in a variety of relationships. So, parent, mother and daughter, parent and child. It includes, domestic abuse can occur between people who aren't in an intimate relationship but who are both parents of the same child. It can occur between, different family members. And it's important to remember that people who are experiencing familial violence, will minimise those concerns and will think that their experiences are normal, and not describe what's happening as abuse. So it's really important that we try to gather as much information about any alleged abuse, that we're coming with our professionally curious hats on, and triangulating information, and really, recognizing that domestic abuse doesn't, just occur in a kind of stereotypical heterosexual relationship between a man and a woman. Okay, so learning point 4 was around recognition of Carol's caring responsibilities. So it was at that time, services didn't recognise Carol as a carer and having the statutory rights to a carer's assessment, because Susan was in a full-time residential placement. It was thought that that meant that Carol couldn't be a carer. Whereas in fact, Carol was, frequently caring for Susan from Friday till Monday, which, is half the week. And so I guess this learning is really around highlighting that, our definition of who a carer is anyone who provides unpaid care for someone who could not cope without the support. So there's no time limits on that. It doesn't say, you can't be a carer if the person who you're caring for is in residential care. And that care can be practical, helping someone, with washing and dressing, but that care can be emotional as well. And, quite often the emotional side of caring can be, really difficult and draining for people. The learning around this is just recognizing that a carer is anyone who provides unpaid care for someone who could not cope without the support. And if someone is a carer, if someone fits that definition, which is very wide, very broad, then they are entitled to a carer's assessment. And under the Care Act, to look at their well-being and look at what matters to them, and to look at what support they need to enable them to carry on caring for their loved one. So I've got another video to show you about carers assessments, but I'm going to have to come out of this slideshow and just go into the internet, so bear with me. I'm going to stop sharing and then fill up the video. I'm going to share my screen. Play this full screen. And again, if you can give me a thumbs up just to confirm you can see in here.
Gemma, I don't think there's any sound. And you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I'm not going to show the video then. I'll go back into the presentation. Okay, so the link to that video will be in the presentation, which will be shared with you. The video just highlights, you know, that what a carer's assessment is, that it is to look at the carer's needs, to look at their well-being, and to look at whether they have eligible needs for support from the local authority. But also it's about looking at the carer's well-being and identifying anything in the community that might support them in their role. Now, locally here in Herefordshire, the way to request a carer's assessment is via the advice and referral team. So that's the phone number there. People can ring up and say, you know, I'm a carer and I'd like a carer's assessment, please. And that will then go through to one of the locality teams, and a social worker will be allocated to do that carers assessment. And in the presentation, there's also a link to Herefordshire Council's carers strategy, which sets out the wider work that the council is doing to support carers, because it is an area of development, and there is lots of change is going to be coming around that. But for now, the most important thing you need to know is that's the phone number for people to ring if they want a carer's assessment. And again, just remember that very broad definition of who a carer is. You know, it's someone who's providing unpaid care and support to someone who can't do without that support. Okay, sorry for the technical hitch. Okay, so the Safeguarding Adults Review did highlight that agencies aren't consistently flagging carers on their systems. So, for example, in that spring, Carol, after Susan moved home, Carol went to A&E with concerns about her mental health, but she wasn't flagged on the A&E system as a carer, so staff weren't aware that, you know, they had someone presenting in a lot of mental distress, and they weren't aware that she was a carer, and that Susan was at home and relying on Carol for care and support. So you know, they're learning through all the organisations really, and in, you know, how do we flag on our systems, on our databases, that someone is a carer, so that when we come into contact with them, we can be mindful of that and thinking about, well, you know, they're caring for someone. Do, you know, how can we make sure that that person is safe? Do I need to talk to any professionals? So we'll think a little bit more about that at the end when we're not recording. Okay, so learning point number 5 was around support and advocacy for Carol. So there was, because Carol wasn't identified as a carer, because it was thought that because Susan was in residential care, Carol couldn't be a statutory carer. So she wasn't, it was thought she wasn't eligible for advocacy, whereas, you know, she really would have benefited from that, because, you know, Carol felt very strongly that she wasn't being listened to. She was very worried about the care that Susan was getting. She was very worried about the medication that Susan was prescribed. And so she used the professionals that she was referred to in her own right to try and advocate for Carol. Whereas if she'd had an advocate who was there specifically for her and to help her express her views in a way that was more appropriate in meetings, she probably would have felt more listened to and like her views had been taken into account more. So the learning around this is that carers are entitled to advocacy, but also if someone isn't a carer but would still benefit from advocacy, we can spot purchase advocacy. That has to be arranged through a social worker, and it has to go through, the ordinary funding panel process. But it is possible for us to spot purchase advocacy, because, like I said, having that independent person to represent someone who has difficulty being involved in care and support planning, can be really invaluable. And the professionals did work very hard with Carol to try and include her, but I think Carol's strength of feeling was so strong that sometimes it impeded on the communication, really. So so the learning is, Carol found it difficult to be involved in the care and support planning, and she would have benefited from an advocate. She could have had an advocate as a carer, but even if she hadn't been recognised as a carer, it could have been spot purchased for her. Again, that has to go through the usual funding processes, but that is a possibility. Okay, and then moving on to the last learning, it was found that there was, good multi-agency working around Susan. There were lots of professionals involved in her life and supporting her, and they worked well together. And Carol was known to lots of different agencies, had lots of referrals to different organisations, but there wasn't multi-agency working between those two groups of professionals. So the professionals involved in Susan's care, weren't made aware of some of the information around Carol that perhaps would have shaped their decision making. It was highlighted that at the time in the January, when Susan decided she was going to return home to live with Carol permanently, it was highlighted that that happened in a very unplanned way, very quickly, and that there were concerns about Carol's mental health at that time, and a multi-agency meeting between Susan and the professionals supporting her and Carol and the professionals around her would have been useful to share information about the whole situation. The review found in the learning event was practitioners found that there was some practitioners were wary of how they could share information with consent, because it was felt that Carol wouldn't have consented to her information, particularly around her mental health. She wouldn't have consented to that being shared with the professionals around Susan. And so I just want to draw your attention here to another policy that the Safeguarding Board has, the information sharing policy, and that is very clear. It sets out that where there's evidence or just a reasonable belief that a child or adult is suffering or at risk of serious harm, and sharing information is intended to prevent this harm, then we can share that information without consent. Now, obviously, we need to be talking to our managers around that. We need to be documenting our decisions and really thinking about that, because that's really impinging on someone's, right to privacy. But where we've got evidence or just a reasonable belief that that adult or child is suffering or at risk of serious harm, and sharing information is intended to prevent that from happening, then we can share information without consent. So that's just, really important to know about. And that's the policy there that kind of sets that out for us. Okay, and then the second part of the learning around that was around jargon, really. There were lots of different professionals involved with Susan, who have different professional backgrounds, which, all of our different specialities come with their own language, come with their own terms. And we need to be very mindful of that we can be using jargon that other professionals might not understand. That was the case in that was found in this review. Carol went to hospital in acute mental health crisis, and the professionals supporting her at that time used language that was not fully understood by the professionals supporting Susan, which meant that there wasn't a shared understanding of the risk around Carol. So it's really important that both that we recognise that we might be using terms that are our bread and butter and everyday to us, but to other professionals might be new. And equally, I think as practitioners, we need to be mindful that, if another professional is using a term that we don't understand, check it out, clarify it. So that we can come away from a conversation feeling confident that both sides have a clear understanding of what's proposed, what the action's going to be, what the level of risk is. And again, related to that, to the learning around, well, how do we flag who a carer is? I've already mentioned that, when Carol was seen in hospital, that information wasn't shared with the professionals around Susan, which might have influenced their decision making. And equally, that learning extends to residential homes as well. If we're working with a carer in whatever capacity, and there's a change in their circumstances that might impact on their ability to care for someone, we need to be sharing that with the whole MDT, really. And multidisciplinary teams, do include residential homes. They do include support services. So we need to be making sure that we're sharing that information in a jargon-free way with other professionals. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly recap the learning then from this particular Safeguarding Adults review. So the learning was around capturing Susan's voice. So it's really important that we see people with learning disabilities alone and offer to meet with them face to face. It's really important we meet face to face as well, and ask whether someone has a health or hospital passport to help us communicate with them. There's learning around professional disagreements, and in this case that relates to Mental Capacity Act assessments. But if you have any differences of opinion with other professionals, there is that policy guidance on resolving professional disagreements that can support us. There's also learning around recognising that domestic abuse can occur within a variety of relationships, and that we need to be professionally curious around that and asking questions and triangulating our information, and making sure that we explore that fully. There's also learning around recognising who a carer is, and making sure that we're offering carers assessments. A carer is anyone who provides unpaid care and support to someone who cannot manage without that support. And I gave you the phone number for how to request a carers assessment. There's also learning around advocacy as well. So carers are entitled to advocates to support them to engage in care and support planning and assessments. But also, if someone is having a substantial difficulty being involved in that process, we can spot purchase advocacy to support that. And then there's learning around multi-agency working, the value of bringing professionals together when something unplanned happened. And we can share information in those forums without someone's consent, where there's evidence or belief that someone is suffering or at risk of suffering serious harm. We can share information without their consent. And again, there's the policy around information sharing to support you with that. And thinking about information sharing as well, it's really important that we do that in a jargon-free way, thinking about the language that we use so that people can, understand and develop a shared understanding of the situation. Okay, so we've got 5 minutes left. I think we can stop the recording now, and we will go on to some questions.